So, people always made fun of the original Perry Mason because at the end of every single episode, as far as I know, every single episode, I never saw one where this didn't happen. But at the end of every single episode, the person who was the actual murderer would be being interrogated by Perry on the stand, and then they would break down and confess. And people would always make fun of this because it was unrealistic and it would never happen in real life. But upon watching the new Perry Mason, I understand a lot better why Perry Mason always did that in the original series, because it gives your series, your courtroom drama, a climax and an emotional climax to boot. And without it, things just feel a little bit anticlimactic, to say the least. So I liked this episode of Perry Mason, but it definitely was not the strongest episode of the season for me personally. But before I get into my specific thoughts with spoilers, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I'm going to be doing upcoming reviews for Lovecraft Country, The Boys, and other shows. And if you're interested in seeing those reviews, please consider subscribing so you don't miss a thing. And if you give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. So right off the bat, I thought it was clever the way that this episode framed the interview with Ennis on the stand. I had actually assumed that they would put Ennis on the stand and have Mason grill him, but the way that they pulled this off was rather clever. I had also suspected that they might try to make fun of the old conceit of Perry Mason having people break down and do a witness stand confession. And because this show is very, very much ashamed of its source material, it only borrows from its source material the bare minimum so that it's recognizable as Perry Mason. Because to a large extent, I've never seen a show so uncomfortable with what its source material was, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way I see it. I don't think that there is even a lot of effort to put in homages to the original for the most part, and most of the characters don't bear much resemblance to their original counterparts. But putting that aside, I think that they very much wanted to say, this is a realistic show, this would never happen, and everybody knows that that would never happen. Fine. But they had to come up with a better climax for this episode. And I think that my wife, who watched this episode with me, felt that perhaps this episode would have played better if you had it be like a special 2-hour episode that ran at the same time as last week's episode. Because on its own, it just didn't feel very eventful. It didn't feel like that much happened this week. There were some pretty compelling speeches, in particular Matthew Rhys's very moving ovation to the jury to try and help them realize that the only thing that Emily Dodson was being convicted for was for the moral failings that she had shown by the standards of her time and for basically her womanhood. And obviously it was a very good speech, and the minute that Maynard Baines started to talk after it was over, it was an interesting decision to have him speak second, because it left you feeling sour when you had been feeling good up until that moment. But a very good speech from Perry Mason, but that was pretty much the highlight of the episode from a dramatic standpoint. Everything else just kind of petered out. I did like the way they made fun of the conceit of having people confess on the stand. I liked how they had Hamilton Berger stand up and tell Perry that it wasn't going to work because nobody confesses on the stand. That was a very good self-referential gag. I especially thought that it was funny that they had Paul Drake playing the part of Ennis and the line where Perry said, "You were going to break, weren't you?" And Paul's like, definitely had a lot of good funny moments with Paul Drake this episode. I particularly liked the end of the episode where they contrasted his way of doing things as an investigator with Strickland's, where Perry's like, "Could I see some receipts?" He's like, "Or you could just trust me." And the fact of the matter is that Paul Drake is very obviously the kind of person that you can trust. And he had some touching moments this episode with his wife on the phone as he told her why he was doing what he was doing, and when he went into the police station to turn in his badge and the money that he had accepted as a bribe. Good for him. I think that he is in some ways the moral center of this show, and he had more at stake arguably than Perry or Della, since he's the one with a family and he's the one who is the most easily gotten rid of if you're a corrupt cop, because no one's going to blink an eye if he was murdered, whereas some other people getting murdered might raise questions. And, you know, all that stuff with Paul Drake was good. I liked the scenes with Perry and Della as they waited for the jury to deliberate and come back. I thought that the natural chemistry between them as actors showed really well during those scenes. I don't like where they left things with Della and Perry at the end of the season, but I'll get to that in a second. I appreciated that it was Della pushing Perry based on her intuitions to put Emily Dodson on the stand that led him to do that. And it does seem like that was the right decision, that it was what swayed the jury ultimately. I think that, you know, it's good that she was able to contribute behind the scenes to Perry ultimately succeeding. And that's where I like seeing Della, is the person behind the scenes contributing, because you have to have people like that. Behind every successful person, there are a ton of support people, male and female. And I think that this show is uncomfortable with the source material, so they're trying to push Della into this co-equal role with Perry, where she's going to be a lawyer too, because they don't want her to be the secretary. They don't want her to be this assistant character. They want her to be equal with Perry because they have to make a statement about gender roles, because they're not comfortable with the gender roles in the original show. You know, I have feelings about this, but I'm not going to get into it. I tend to think that her role as a supporting player was fine and was perfectly interesting, and I feel like it's going to be hard for them to write this new dynamic. But we'll see. I'll reserve judgment until we see how it plays out in future seasons. But I am less excited to see her as an attorney than I was in her role this season, because I just felt that there was a certain dynamic between her and Perry, not because he was over her, but because her role played to her strengths and she was able to do things that Perry arguably couldn't. So, you know, water under the bridge though. Strickland, moving on. It was interesting. All season I was predicting he was going to die. But this episode, the biggest thing he did was that he bribed a juror, which it goes into the theme that they kind of established, that Perry is willing to do things that are wrong to make sure that justice is ultimately served. But the question I have to ask is, how is that different than a cop lying on the stand to make sure that a guilty person gets convicted? Because if you think that's the right thing, then you could justify doing that. And as the producers of this show, or a writer, I forget which, had said that they had been told by a prominent police person that you can't trust anything a police officer says on the stand, because this prominent police officer had told them that the police will lie if they think the suspect is guilty to get them put away. And obviously that had a very, very formative effect on the way that the show portrays the police. But my question is, how is what Perry and Strickland try to do any different? If they're bribing a juror to get a person they believe is innocent off, what if they're not innocent? That's not how the justice system is intended to work. Now, obviously, the justice system was not portrayed in a very flattering way in this show this season. And obviously it does have flaws. But that said, when one person makes a determination like this to go behind the scenes of the system and to force its hand, that to me is wrong, whichever way you're doing it. Thankfully, it ended up not being what won the case, because two other jurors were persuaded to vote that Emily Dodson was not guilty based on the evidence. And the best scene for me in the aftermath of the trial was when Maynard Baines just lost it and started swearing angrily at a reporter. That was a good end to his character. I'm not sure if they'll bring him back next season, but obviously he lost a case that he really, really needed to win. And to see him so frustrated and to blow his top like that was very, very satisfying after watching all that he had put Emily Dodson through on the stand and in this trial. Ennis ultimately got justice too. I felt that this was kind of a contrived circumstance. I understand what they were portraying. It seemed to me that because they had potentially the men from the brothel or someone connected to the people from the brothel drowning him, it could be that, it's because that girl he killed. They never really tied themselves down to a reason. Clearly his partner wanted him gone because he had created so many problems for him. And it was pretty obvious when this scene started because it was framed exactly the same way that the church elder that Ennis killed, his death was framed. They were very, very similar scenes in the setup, but it was much less surprising this time. It was pretty obvious they were going to kill Ennis from the get-go. But I found this to be a relatively anticlimactic and unsatisfying end for this character. Not the least of which because Ennis was the big bad. I really thought this whole season that there was someone covertly pulling the strings that was not in full view, but apparently, Ennis obviously was working together with the church accountant, but other than those two and the people that had already died in the first episode, there was no one else involved, apparently, it seems. So that wasn't very satisfying. There weren't really any revelations this episode. We kind of knew everything last episode, so that was part of the reason that I felt that maybe this episode should have been kind of tagged on last episode as an epilogue, because there just wasn't enough happening in this episode. Obviously, the way Emily Dodson ended up was pretty interesting. I was worried that they were going to have her actually believe that the child was her child because, they're trying to show how naive and stupid she is. But I liked this ending better because it allowed her to retain her intelligence, but she's making a choice to devote her life to this child and to the church willingly, knowing that what she's doing is a lie. And that's the beautiful lie that Christopher Nolan so often explores in his films, and I think that's a good end to her character. It's not completely redemptive, and we can view it with cynicism and suspicion, but I think that it is a somewhat happy end for someone who has been set up for a really, really miserable fate by the justice system. I wish there had been more of a callback to Burchard. I feel like it would have been nice to have Perry go to his grave or something at the end of the season, but there really wasn't any callbacks to him at all. And the way that they did end with Perry tracking down Sister Alice, this was an odd decision to me because she wasn't in this entire episode. Like, the last we saw of her was her running away at the end of last episode. So it was an odd, again, I feel like if they had tagged this on to last episode, it would have been a stronger decision. His conversation with her, it was decent. I felt that it was kind of the whole way that non-religious people try to placate religious people by saying, well, none of what you believe really makes sense, or there's no evidence for it, but there's just some things that you have to believe because even if they might not be things that you can demonstrate are true, they make you happy anyways, and there's just deeper emotional truths. It's like, okay, Jordan Peterson. Anyway, so I'm excited for future seasons of this show because I think it did have a nice full cycle of a story, and I think you could just make innumerable stories in this world if you want to, just like there were so many cases in the original show. So I'm glad to have this show around. I think it's better than a lot of people think it is, but overall this episode was not my favorite episode of this season. So those are my thoughts, but let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this one, please consider subscribing, and as always, you can watch more videos right now.